Brilliant. Thank you for the introduction and hello to everyone joining online today. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about how to start a conversation with public partners about estimands. And this will include a presentation of a practical tool that you can use to start a conversation in this area and a more public partner friendly estimand language that you can use. Okay, so first off, I must importantly acknowledge the Healthy Stats Public Involvement Group who've worked with me on the work that I'm presenting today. So the members of the group include Anya, who is my co-chair, and then also Paul, Manos, Joanna and Yasmin. And also fellow researchers, Brennan Kahan, Akshay Patel and Beatrice Goulet. And also acknowledgements go to Marie Miller, who's Imperial Clinical Trials Unit's Public Involvement Coordinator, who helped me form this group. And also to the NIHR and to the Trials Methodology Research Partnership for providing funding, and the NHR through my fellowship. So to set the scene, I'm going to start by introducing what an estimand is to you in the context of clinical trials and discuss why we should think about involving patients in estimand discussions. So just in case you're not overly familiar with an estimand or why they matter. And then I'll outline the initial work that we've done in this area. And so this includes the development of an estimand explainer tool that you can use to start a conversation about estimands with public partners. And then I'll present a simpler, more accessible language to use on estimands that was subsequently developed with public partners. And I'll finish with a summary, including next steps in this area. Okay, so clinical trials. We conduct these to identify beneficial new treatments. So after collecting lots of data, statisticians like me will do calculations to work out how well the treatment being tested works. But what I'd like you to think about here is actually what precisely are we aiming to calculate and find out to establish if a new treatment works? Now, I'll come back to trials in a minute, but just for now, I'd like you to imagine you're buying a new car. So you go to a car dealership and spot a little green car that takes your fancy. Now, if you ask the salesperson, would this car work for me and suit my lifestyle? Now, you might not actually get the answer you're after, as this question is very vague. Now, what you or I actually want to know about the car might be quite different, and this would be depending on who we are and how we intend to use the car. So, for example, suppose if you lived in the countryside, you'd probably be wanting to know, is the car reliable off-road conditions as well as on-road? Now, if you're a travelling business person, perhaps, I don't know, you're an area manager for Tesco's or Asda that involves going to stores up and down the motorway, you'd be wanting to know, does the car achieve high speeds? Or if you had a young family, you might want to know whether the car has good safety features and whether it's suitable for children. So really, to fully understand if a new car works well for you, you actually need to ask a more precise question that captures the conditions under which you intend to use the car. Now, just like buying a car, clinical trials can actually ask very different questions, and these can be quite specific to find suitable new treatments for patients. And this is because different patients can use treatments differently, and they have different experiences in a trial. So for instance, in one trial, we could find out the answer to 3 different questions. So for example, what was the treatment effect for all of the patients, even if the treatment is not taken exactly as instructed? Or we could ask, what is the treatment effect for only those patients who could tolerate the treatment? Or we could ask, what is the treatment effect if all patients take the treatment exactly as they are asked? So these are all subtly different questions. And the fact is, there's just not one single treatment effect or question that's addressed by all trials. So trials ask different questions, and multiple different questions could be asked. And different stakeholders, so for example, policymakers and patients, might actually be interested in the answer to quite different questions. Now, why does this all matter? Well, this matters because asking different questions about a treatment might actually end up leading you to quite different impressions about how useful that treatment is. Just like how understanding the exact conditions a car works well under might lead to different conclusions on how useful a particular car is for different people. So just as an example here with a trial, so I'd like you to consider this recent randomized trial that was conducted in type 2 diabetes. So this compared a once weekly insulin regimen to a once daily regimen, and this was on the change from baseline in the glycated hemoglobin at week 26. Now in the trial, in both treatment groups, patients were allowed to receive ancillary treatment. So this is just additional medication if they needed it. And there were also patients that stopped their randomized treatment early before the 26-week time point of outcome measurement. Now, the occurrence of the post-randomization events, such as these two, mean that multiple different types of questions can then be asked in the trial. Now, this trial in question that's actually previously been done asked two different questions. So firstly, it asked what was the mean difference in the glycated hemoglobin for the once-weekly insulin regimen compared to the once-daily regimen, regardless of the amount of randomized treatment or ancillary treatment received. So this gives a result of minus 0.09 percentage points with a p-value of 0.35. But secondly, this trial also asked what was the mean difference in the glycated hemoglobin for that once-weekly regimen compared to the once-daily, if all participants had actually hypothetically adhered to the treatment regimens and also not received any ancillary treatment. And this gave a result of minus 0.18 percentage points and a p-value of 0.08. So you see, a much more positive conclusion would be reached for the once-weekly regimen from asking the second question. So the effect size is twice the size here. So I hope this illustrates why it's important to define and understand the precise question that individual trials address for the treatments under study. And this is so that the results can be properly understood. And this is just exactly where estimands come in. As an estimand, it's formally defined as a precise description of the treatment effect you want to find out in a trial. And I guess for those of you who are new to estimands, just to kind of remember what it is, you can think of an estimand as a description of exactly what you demand to find out, as the demand nicely rhymes with the estimand there. But an estimand basically captures what patient population and under what precise conditions you are assessing a particular specified treatment effect. Now, we're talking about estimands today following drug trial guidelines, the ICH E9R1, which came out in November 29. So actually quite a few years ago now. And this calls for trialists to define estimands at the initial point of trial development. So when you're first planning a trial and developing your protocol. And this is so that the trial that you do is actually subsequently designed and then can be conducted and analysed to actually answer the question of interest that matters the most. And also using estimands means that at the end of the trial, everyone understands exactly what the trial has found out. Now, where do patients and the public come in, and why should we consider involving them in estimand discussions? Well, previous research has shown that patients and the public want to say in the research question and the direction. And so being involved in defining the estimand in trials is essential to achieve that. So this implies that patients and the public would want to say on what estimands a trial is addressing. Now, not so long ago, I held an online workshop that introduced estimands for trialists, which I guess as an offside, you can actually find all the recordings for this on YouTube afterwards if you want to find more out about estimands. So if you just searched for MRC NIHR estimand workshop in YouTube, it will come up. But I'd like to highlight a quote here given from Professor Amanda Adler, who's director of the Diabetes Trials Unit at Oxford. So she, during the workshop, summed it up really nicely on how estimands are for patients and for the people that would benefit from the trial the most. But we do need to provide a rationale to select one estimand strategy over another, which potentially requires patient involvement. So evidence to date suggests we should perhaps be including patients in estimand conversations to decide what the trial should address. But the question remains as to what patients and the public actually think about this, and then how do we go about doing so? So I first set out to establish whether public partners want to be involved in estimand discussions during trial planning. And now here, just to be clear, I'm defining public partners as patients or members of the public who are part of the research team. So they're not trial participants, they're patients or public who are actually working with researchers to help design trials. And so to do this, I held an online meeting with public partners from the Healthy Stats Public Involvement Group. So this group included 5 public partners, so they were aged between 20 and 70 years with mixed ethnicity and sex. And the meeting also included 4 facilitators, so 4 researchers, to facilitate breakout room discussions. And this included myself, Brennan Kahan, Akshay Patel, and Beatrice Goulet. Now, the specific aims of the first meeting were to co-develop a practical tool with public partners that helps to explain the concept of what an estimand is and what impact it may have on trial results. As first and foremost, we need to be able to communicate about what an estimand is. And then secondly, to explore public partners' perspectives on the importance of discussing estimands with public partners when designing a trial. So let's look at what we found out. So at the meeting, we reviewed a tool together. So this was a 2-page leaflet that was drafted before the meeting by the researchers to explain what an estimand is and why it matters. Now, initially, upon first use of the term estimand, unsurprisingly, the public partners highlighted how the estimand term really was felt to be a piece of statistical jargon. It was uninteresting for them to know. They said how if we do use this term around public partners, we do really need to carefully first explain what it means. So this provided some initial general support for why an estimand explainer tool was needed. When we sort of were looking at the tool, public partners fed back that they found the tool useful to start a discussion about what question a trial is answering in a trial design context. So they specifically recommended the use of storytelling and analogies and visual aids on the tool, which I'll show you in a minute. And it was felt that the tool should be shared, and there should also be a chance to discuss it with the trial team or a statistician provided. So not quite standalone. And then public partners raised that this tool would not be indicated for potential trial participants. So this is just for public partners, part of the research team. And actually, they were unsure if patients who are considering going into the trial actually need to know about the estimand of the trial's addressing. I'm going to come back to that shortly. So after sort of reviewing the tool together, after the meeting, the tool was then updated using the feedback in an iterative process where further feedback was sought by email, and then we had 2 rounds of refinement. And then this is what we end up with. So it's a 2-page leaflet explaining what an estimand is and why they're important. So this actually starts on page 1 with the buying of the new car analogy that I presented to you at the very start of this talk today. So that was informed by the public partners. And the storytelling and analogies and visual aids within the tool was what was really highly supported by the public partners. Actually, initially, the first page was a bit more colourful, but we changed it so that it was suitable for people who are colourblind. And then on page 2, we have an example of a headache prevention trial to demonstrate why estimands matter. Now, I appreciate the text quite small here, so I'm just going to zoom in on this second page now. So you can see this introduces a 2-group trial setting, and this is comparing a new tablet against a dummy treatment tablet for people with severe headaches. So it explains how a group of patients were given the dummy treatment whilst another group were given the new treatment. And both of the treatment groups had to take their tablets 4 times a day, but it details how some participants in the new tablet group stopped taking the treatment early because they actually had side effects of stomach cramps. Now, the leaflet then goes on to illustrate how asking different questions in this headache trial can lead to quite different results, and therefore why it's important to get involved when thinking about what question a trial should answer. So, for example, the first question that could be asked in this trial was, what was the typical, so average reduction in the number of headaches for a participant, even if they did not take all 4 tablets each day? And this gives an answer of half a headache. Now, a second question that could be asked actually was, what was a typical average reduction in the number of headaches for a participant who took all 4 tablets each day? And this gives an answer of 4 tablets. 4 headaches. So you see you can get quite different answers here. And then the leaflet just finishes with bringing in the estimand definition to refer to the exact question that a trial is aiming to answer. Okay, so at the meeting, after considering the communication of the concept of an estimand, So we then also explored the public partners' perspectives on the importance of discussing estimands with public partners when designing a trial. And I'll now summarise the 4 key topics that came out of our discussions. So firstly, public partners highlighted the importance of selecting outcomes that matter to the patient so that we conduct trials that matter to patients. So they did understand that we could find out the answer to many different questions and felt we should be asking patients what they want from the trial and how they would want to say, and especially if it was public funded research. Now, they did acknowledge that we can't always serve everyone, so we might not always be able to sort of address exactly what patients want, but they felt it was important to talk to patients and get their views so we could get the middle ground, perhaps. Now, they felt it was important to involve patients early on in initial trial planning. So when we have our initial trial planning meetings, make sure they're there so that trials do actually give the answers that are relevant to patients. And to achieve this, they said that education and communication from researchers was felt necessary, as this is a new area familiar to patients. And they acknowledged that this would take time and be labour intensive to educate people to know how to ask the right question. And they felt it would require a change of culture of researchers and public partners working closer together to achieve this. Because they felt what we're talking about really is a complex issue for the layperson. So from the point of view of someone who has been in trials and looked at lay English summaries, so we had some people in the group who had done that, they felt that the level of information is very complex already that you're given, for example, on the patient information sheet. So there's a need to break barriers and make it clear as to why this is important to patients and how it benefits patients. So to summarise sort of our initial work here, so overall, we found that there was support from public partners to involve public partners in choosing estimands. And there was support to use the co-produce tool, so that we produced with the Healthy Stats group with public partners to initiate discussions doing trial planning. As if you're going to talk about estimands, you need to first carefully explain what an estimand is. Okay, so following these initial findings, and specifically leading on from how the estimand term was felt to be a piece of statistical jargon, so I realised there was further work required on the language we use to talk about estimands with public partners. So after initiating a conversation in this area, if we are to involve public patients in deciding estimands, we need our further language to also be friendly. Because us researchers do use other terms when talking about estimands that could be considered, again, probably bits of jargon to public partners. So when we get into the more nitty-gritty of estimands, there are actually 5 recognised attributes to an estimand by researchers that we must specify to complete an estimand definition. Now, these are interrelated, but they include the treatment conditions. So this explains what treatment conditions we're comparing, so what groups we've got. Population, so this refers to who we are finding out the treatment effect for in a trial. There's the variable, so this is what outcome are we looking at the treatment effect on. The summary measure, which refers to what statistic are we using to compare groups. So this might be a mean difference, difference in proportions. And then we've got how intercurrent events are to be handled in the definition of the treatment effect. So that is what we want to address with respect to intercurrent events. Now, you might be wondering exactly what an intercurrent event is, because this is another non-friendly term, but intercurrent events are defined as post-randomization events which affect the interpretation or occurrence of outcome data in a trial. So, for example, an example of intercurrent event is treatment discontinuation, so stopping treatment early, failure to start treatment. Perhaps participants might switch treatments in the trial or use a wrong dose of the treatment, maybe higher or lower than what was prescribed, or they might use some alternative medication, such as a rescue medication, or they might die. So all these events, if they happen to a patient, it then affects the interpretation of their outcome. So when defining an estimand, it's important that we specify how relevant intercurrent events are handled in the definition of the treatment effect. And so this completes the description of precisely what we're intending to address in the trial. So I guess as we saw for the diabetes trial earlier and the headache trial, different handling of the intercurrent events of stopping treatment early can lead to different conclusions. So this is really why we need to think about them. So in subsequent meetings with the Healthy Stats group, we then further considered the language used to describe the 5 parts of an estimand together. And specifically, together, we addressed the research question of how can we improve the language used to describe the 5 parts of an estimand for public partners. So this to further facilitate the involvement of public partners in deciding estimands. So I guess just to reiterate, we're still in the context of how we can communicate to public partners who are involved in trial design and planning. So this was done over 2 meetings. So we had one online meeting followed by one in-person meeting. And the aim was to devise new language to use with public partners to describe the 5 parts of the estimand. So yeah, this was with the same Healthy Stats group who had the previous meeting with. So first up, got the findings from the first online meeting. So at this meeting, I introduced the language that researchers use to describe the 5 parts of the estimand. So the 5 parts of the research question. So as summarised on screen, this is what I showed to the public partners. So the 5 elements with the short description. So I just showed this to you, but we've got obviously the treatment conditions. So what treatment conditions are we actually comparing? Population, who we are answering the question for. Outcome, what measurements are we making the comparison for? Handling of intercurrent events. So how are we handling events that happened in the trial and may affect what we're actually measuring, such as stopping treatment, and the summary measure. So what statistic are we actually using to look at the difference? So I showed this to the public partners, and the main clear sort of initial takeaway, confirming my initial suspicion, was that the language around these 5 parts of the research question really does need to be improved for public partners. So there was quite a lot of confused faces and an uncertainty on what these parts meant. So they really initially didn't really like these terms at all. So we discussed them one by one in depth to see if we could come up with improved proposals on how we discuss these parts. So firstly, treatment condition. So they found this confusing because the condition part, the second part, made them actually rather think of the condition as the illness. So for example, diabetes in our earlier example. And then they also sort of commented that the treatment part of it sounds like a cure. So it might not be the best term, especially as one sort of condition in the trial might be no treatment at all or placebo. So combined, they really sort of didn't like the treatment condition phrase here. They weren't keen on it to describe what we're really meaning. But after discussion, it was felt that what is the trial comparing was just proposed as a better alternative, simpler to eliminate doubt of what this element is referring to. So we don't need to use treatment conditions at all. We can just say, what's the trial comparing? So for the next element, the population. So there was a bit of discussion about really what population meant. And then we settled on how it would be much simpler to just simply express this as for who. And then the description of outcome by itself, again, that didn't make much sense. People weren't really sure what this was referring to. So it was then discussed that it would be simpler and better to just say what difference is being measured. And unsurprisingly, handling of intercurrent events didn't mean anything. So we did discuss this for a while, and actually sort of kind of found the best way to talk about intercurrent events was really just to give examples. Because I think even for researchers, intercurrent events is sort of a maybe not the best phrase, but there aren't sort of any other, so it's hard to think of an alternative. So it was good using examples. But what we came up with was, instead of referring to this element as what is being done about expected or unexpected events that happen to patients in the trial. So for example, stopping prescribed medication early or taking other non-trial medications. But there was sort of agreement amongst the group that they wanted to revisit this definition for this 4th element. So we'll come to that very shortly. And then the 5th element, they didn't like summary measure. Instead, they preferred this to sort of just be re-expressed as what statistical measure are we using? But there was also feedback amongst the group that actually there was unsure if element 5 was actually useful for public partners, whether they needed to have a discussion or have a say on this 5th element at all. So we came back to consider these again in a second meeting to sort of further discuss this, realizing that we needed more time to sort of focus on this and maybe refine our elements. And so we had our second in-person meeting to come up with an updated proposal on the language. And after further discussions, on screen now is what you're seeing is the preferred language to use. So I guess first off, after further discussion, we ruled out element 5, so the summary measure, as being important to discuss with public partners. So they actually felt that this was an element that they didn't really need to consider with researchers. It was for the statisticians and trialists to come up with what was most relevant. And so we were left with what they like to be termed the 4 pillars of the research question. So the 4 pillars of our estimand being what is the trial testing? What people or condition are we trying to help? What is being measured? And how are researchers handling unplanned participant-related events? For example, stopping prescribed medication early or taking other non-trial medications. So this was our sort of updated proposal. Now, so with our new language, let's now see what the new proposal means for designing an example trial in eczema. So I'd like you to suppose we're designing a trial conducted for children with chronic eczema. So they'll be randomized to either placebo or a new biological treatment for 24 weeks. And the treatment's taken by injection every 2 weeks. And then after 24 weeks, the severity of the eczema will be recorded for each child based on the change in an eczema severity score. Now, it's anticipated that not all the children will take the treatment as prescribed for 24 weeks. So it's quite a demanding, really, treatment for a child to be taking an injection every 2 weeks. So we consider designing this trial and working out our estimands. Now, when seeking public partner input on estimands during trial planning, such as for this trial, public partners sort of saw this as a 3-step process. So first, important just to discuss the general trial setting and obtain any initial general thoughts on the trial from your public partners. But then secondly, if you want to talk about estimands, you then want to introduce what an estimand is and why it's important. So this is where our tool can come in handy to use. And then you can discuss potential estimands that researchers are considering using the 4 pillars of the research question language. And then get the public partners' feedback on the estimands. So public partners felt it was useful for researchers to come up with some proposed estimands, and then we can discuss and develop them together, rather than them having to initially come up with some proposed estimands, which would probably be a bit too steep. So let's now explore a couple of potential research questions, so estimands for this eczema trial that could be proposed with public partners with updated language using our 4 pillars of the estimand, which can then be discussed. So one potential research question is for this trial is, how does the biologic compare to placebo, even if not all of the biologic or placebo is received? This is for children with chronic eczema on the average change in the eczema severity score. So we can see the 4 pillars more clearly in the table than below to discuss. So what's the trial testing? So it's biologic versus placebo. What people condition are we trying to help? So it's children with chronic eczema. What is being measured? So this is the change in eczema severity score. And how are researchers handling the unplanned participant-related events? So here our unplanned event is the stopping of the biologic or placebo early. And the solution or handling here is actually we're interested in knowing how the biologic or placebo performs, ignoring any stopping treatment early. Okay, and a second potential estimand for this trial that could be discussed is, how does the biologic compare against placebo? Again, for children with chronic eczema who take all doses as prescribed on the average change in eczema severity score. And now for the 4 pillars of the estimand here, so the first 3 pillars are the same, so these haven't changed. But this question, we're just changing how the researchers are handling the unplanned participant-related event of stopping the biologic or placebo early. And here, the solution now for this estimand is that we're only interested in those who take all doses as prescribed. So what we're doing, so this is a kind of a way that participant public partners and researchers can sort of start a discussion about specific estimands that they want public partners' feedback on. Now, with the Healthy Stats group, we did look at these two questions for this sort of proposed example trial. But obviously, we weren't doing this in a real trial planning setting. So we didn't really have a really in-depth discussion on these two estimands because the public partners also, they weren't sort of eczema patients. But when we did sort of look at these two questions, just interestingly, they actually wanted the trial to address both of these questions. They felt that they were both important to know. Now, our discussions that I'll just summarise up to here with you. So these focus on the language to use with public partners who are involved in trial planning and design. So those working with researchers. And so it was a clear message that all four pillars of the estimand were considered important and important to know and discuss with researchers to have a say on the estimand. But we did also discuss whether trial participants, so those considering going into a trial or those in a trial, would want to know the estimand elements that the actual trial is addressing. Now, it was felt that actually we don't really want to make things more confusing or unload the patient information sheet with any additional information that isn't essential. And then also they sort of commented on that some of the information might actually impact patient behaviour, which we don't want. So they felt that the first three elements were important. So what's the trial testing, what people condition are we trying to help, and what's being measured. But these would naturally already be in the patient information sheet. The fourth one on the unplanned participant-related events, they actually felt that this wasn't essential. So that wouldn't need to be added into patient information sheets. So their sort of initial feedback was that we don't really need to sort of bring the estimand in there. And then finally, we also touched on what just general patients and members of the public using trial results want to know. So those who maybe are sort of looking up trial results to decide whether they want to take a particular treatment or not. Now, it was felt from the Healthy Stats group that they would want to know so such patients and members of the public would want to know the underlying estimand, and they would want to know all four pillars behind a result. This so that they could be able to sort of properly understand the trial result. And especially the last fourth element, so the one on how researchers are handling unplanned events, such as stopping treatment early in the trial. Because they actually felt that this might actually affect future patients' behaviour and in how they actually take a treatment in real life. So it might influence how they take the treatment and perhaps encourage adherence. Because if a trial has shown that a treatment sort of works a lot better if all of it's taken compared to sort of if not all of it's taken, then it might encourage members of the public to really stick to their treatment a bit better. So I found that really interesting. So just to summarise, overall, with the Healthy Stats group, we found that there is support to involve public partners in choosing estimands. So public partners think we should be doing this and that individuals would want to have a say so that trials do address what really matters to patients and the public. So we've developed a 2-page leaflet that's available now as a tool that people can use to start a conversation about what an estimand is and why it matters. And we've also developed a simpler estimand language acceptable for public partners to describe parts of the estimand. Now, our next steps, we are just developing a 3rd page, which will be added to the Estimand Explainer tool to explain those 4 pillars. So those that are important for public partners to discuss with researchers. And also going to shortly share that and discuss the language of a different group of public partners to collect further feedback. Now, just on future work, I guess my discussions with the Healthy Stats group have identified other important avenues for future research. So they expressed how ideally journals would have lay summaries communicating results to patients with clear communication of the underlying estimand. So we know now some journals do, some of the really good journals have lay summaries communicating results to patients, but actually the estimand isn't clear. It's not clear sort of whether a result has been constructed based on everyone taking the treatment properly or not. But obviously tackling this is an important area for future research, highlighted by the group. They specifically, a member said that people see what they want to see. lay summaries need to be factual and clear without space to misinterpret. So making sure that the estimand is clear here really is key to achieve this. And so my co-chair, Anya, particularly highlighted a need for educating patients and researchers about lay summaries, and that there's probably a need for a lay summary course where hopefully us researchers need to think about getting all the details of the estimand into our summaries. But this is a really big area to tackle beyond the scope of this work that I did here and estimands alone. So I would really be interested to hear from anyone who's on the line today who's got an interest in this area for future work. So please do feel free to contact me afterwards. My contact email is at the bottom of the screen here. And then just at the top, I've got the reference here to our 2-page tool that can be used to start a conversation about estimands with public partners. And for researchers, just giving you a link there to the videos on the recording of the estimand workshop. And I guess just to highlight and plug, next week, we've got a primer coming out in the BMJ that's, again, explaining estimands with some examples. So if you've listened today and want to know more about estimands, look out for that paper hitting next week. But that brings me to the end of my talk. I'm happy to take a few questions.